Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to this series, which I'm calling Leaders I Love. And if you've been following this series, you'll know that I've been speaking to leaders here in New Zealand and around the world who, in my opinion, are demonstrating inspiring, authentic leadership. And in particular, are demonstrating or providing their people the qualities of stability, trust, hope, and compassion. So I'm so delighted to have here with me today Dr. Kristin Neff, who is a pioneer in the world of, or the field of, self-compassion research and one of the world's leading experts in self-compassion. And I've been following your work, Kristin, for several years. I have the workbook, which is just one of many things that you have produced. You've written extensively on the subject, you speak extensively on the subject, and I believe that you were the first to operationally define self-compassion and to measure it through the creation of self-compassion scales. Is that right?
Yes, you could say that. I mean, I didn't come up with the idea. A lot of people had talked about the importance of self-compassion, but yes, I created a scale to measure it and a definition and kind of got the research ball rolling, you might say. Yeah.
Which makes it so accessible for so many of us because, you know, it is a construct. It is something that we can say we understand the idea of compassion and self-compassion, but to break it down into specific measures, actions, you know, sub-qualities, if you like, I think makes it so accessible. So thank you for your work in this space, and thank you for being here with me today to answer a few key questions for us here in New Zealand.
Sure, yeah, happy to be here.
So in New Zealand and around the world, I'm sure you'll agree, I'm seeing an outpouring of love and generosity in this time through COVID-19, so much compassion. And I think arguably we could say that it's easier to give compassion, to direct it outwards to other people than to direct it inwards to yourself. And yet it's so critical to practice self-compassion, especially now with job redundancies and role reshaping. Self-esteem and self-worth is really taking a knock. And I think what that does is it elevates or heightens that sense of uncertainty and fear. And Brené Brown talks about through her research that the number one fear at work is the fear of being irrelevant. So I would love it if you could talk to us a little about the difference between self-esteem and self-compassion.
Sure, right. So self-esteem is an evaluation of self-worth, basically a judgment. Am I a good, worthy person or am I a bad, unworthy person? And so we know that self-esteem, it's good for mental health. People who have high self-esteem, they're less depressed, they're happier than people who hate themselves. But there's a lot of downsides with self-esteem. It's not so much having it, it's how do you get your self-esteem? So most people, they get their self-esteem in a couple ways. One is through social comparison, right? How do I stack up to him or her, right? And of course, to have self-esteem, we need to feel special and above average. It's not okay to be average. So we're always, subtly trying to find ways where we can puff up our own egos and put others down. A lot of actually nasty social behaviors like bullying, whether it's schoolyard bullying or workplace bullying. Part of what's behind it is the bully gets a self-esteem boost when he or she is able to pick on someone and like put them down in a way in comparison. So that's not very healthy at all. The other problem with self-esteem is that it's contingent, right? It's contingent on success. So either successful in the sense that we look the way we want to look, or people like us as much as we want them to, or we're successful in business or sports or whatever it is we value. Our self-esteem is only there when things are good, but then what happens when we lose our job or we gain, a certain amount of weight or people reject us, then our self-esteem deserts us. So you might say self-esteem is a fair weather friend, right? It's there for us in good times, but it's not there when we need it most, and that's when times are really difficult. And so self-compassion is, it's a type of self-worth, but it's not a judgment or an evaluation at all. It's simply acknowledging that we are a flawed human being who makes mistakes, that leads a challenging life, and being kind to ourselves, because we're human. So in other words, the sense of self-worth with compassion, you don't have to be better than anyone else. You just have to be a flawed human being like everyone else. I can do that. And it's also not contingent on success. In other words, it's precisely when we fail or feel inadequate or struggle in some way that when we give ourselves compassion for the pain of that, and that's where self-compassion is actually at its strongest. So we know through research, for instance, compared to self-esteem, the sense of self-worth that comes from self-compassion is much more stable over time. And it's also linked to mental health, the way self-esteem is, right? So the same strong associations with, less anxiety, depression, greater happiness, greater motivation, greater physical health. So you might say it has the benefits of self-esteem without the pitfalls.
Yeah, and it sounds like, this is probably, a crude observation, but it sounds like self-esteem potentially lives more in the mind, the mental space, whereas self-compassion is a full body, embodied way of being.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So self-esteem really is a judgment or an evaluation. It's more cognitive. Now, of course, there's some feeling components in that it feels good to have high self-esteem. It's rewarding, and it feels bad to have low self-esteem. But it's more of a judgment. And so self-compassion really is a way of relating to ourselves. So for instance, one of the ways I teach people to be compassionate with themselves is through the use of physical touch. Right, because as human beings, one of the primary ways we communicate care and compassion is through touch. First 2 years of life, parents and babies, they don't share. The baby doesn't speak yet, so a lot of communication of care and safety and kindness is communicated through touch. So it'd be hard to boost your self-esteem by like putting your hands on your body. Like, what does that mean? But you actually can help yourself feel safe and cared for by putting your hands on your body. What you're doing is you're actually changing your physiology. You're activating your parasympathetic nervous system, the one that makes you feel safe and cared for and calm, relaxed. So it actually is more embodied than self-esteem.
I love that. I understand that, and I think mentioning children is so perfect, because children are our best teachers, and those of us who are parents who are at home with our kids and have been now for weeks, if we can be mindful and present enough, there is a lot that we can learn from them. So that's a really great point. Back to the workplace and organizations though, there's some tough decisions that are having to be made. So tough commercial decisions, compassion. How can leaders balance the two at work or at school or any organization, any collective?
Yeah, so in terms of balance, do you mean compassion for self and others? Or
and how do you weave in that compassion for self and others at a time when you're having to make those really tough commercial decisions, looking at the balance sheet, looking at the survival of the business?
Right. Yeah. So in many ways, what compassion is compassion is a motivation, the motivation to alleviate suffering. And so if that's your motivation, that can take a lot of different forms. So in some ways, I have a nonprofit, right? And so we had to make some hard financial decisions. But if we don't exist as an organization, we can't do our mission of spreading compassion in the world. So really, in many ways, compassion is a type of wisdom as well. A lot of wisdom is part of compassion. What's the best course of action to help alleviate suffering? And so that might mean sometimes, you've got to make hard decisions. You may have to lay some people off, for instance, so that you can survive. And hopefully you try to do that with, the minimum negative consequences possible. But you need to see the big picture with self-compassion. Some people think self-compassion is weak or it's just being nice. Sometimes self-compassion is kind of quite fierce. In other words, you need to protect yourself. You need to say, I'm sorry. I would love to be able to do things differently, but I just can't. And you need to stick to your guns. That's also part of self-compassion, to protect what's valuable to you. And so self-compassion, it has a soft, tender side, but it also has kind of a hard, fierce side. Just like I like to call it the mama side of compassion and mama bear side of compassion, right? So mama bear is like that fierce energy, where sometimes to protect what we love, we need to take strong, very sometimes hard actions. And I think in this context, we're needing to do both. you
Mm.
know, and also in terms of being very, very vigilant to protect ourselves and our workers in terms of our health. That's also very important. You know,
Mm. It's
being
really,
compassionate. Oh yeah, everyone come in. Oh, you don't have a mask. Don't worry about it. You know, it's okay. I love everyone. That's not compassionate. You know, that's foolish. You have to be wise. That's part of being compassionate.
yeah.
Uh,
I love that. I love the reference to motivation and wisdom. And I think what you're really talking about is boundaries as well, when you
yes.
talk about protection. And I think that's how compassion links into some of those other three qualities that I mentioned, which the Gallup Organisation has said people are looking for in leaders in times of crisis. Because compassion in that way, when you are the mama bear and you are being very fierce and protective, you are anchoring in, aren't you, and really grounding and providing yourself and others a sense of stability and therefore trust, would you say?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So really, some people are under the misperception that self-compassion, like I say, is soft or it's weak. Self-compassion is incredibly strong, right? And that strength that comes from, really being committed to alleviating suffering, committed to the common good, committed to doing what you need to for yourself and others to keep people safe and stable and well. That stability is something, it's a strength that can be relied on.
Yeah.
And in terms of leaders as well. Now, I have to be honest, we don't have a lot of research on self-compassion in leaders, but we know that self-compassion is linked to qualities that are valued in leaders. Things like wisdom, things like creativity, things like motivation, things like grit. Self-compassion leads to grit. So I'm sure once we finally do get around to looking at leaders with more self-compassion, we'll see that they make better leaders if they're self-compassionate.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure, all of us watching this and, myself sitting here, when I think about the leaders who I relate to the most and am inspired by the most, they absolutely have an element of compassion for me and others, but they do have that strength and fierceness like you're talking about. And you say that self-compassion can be learned. So as a final question, I would love to ask if you could share one thing that people who are watching this can do today really easily to start to cultivate that quality within themselves.
Yeah, so actually one of the reasons it can be learned is because we already know how to be compassionate to other people.
Mm.
Right? So we have a lot of experience in terms of what to say and how to say it. So a very simple practice is when you're hurting in some way, either you're struggling because of something that's happening in your life or you're feeling badly about yourself, you can just simply ask yourself, what if I had a dear friend who is going through the exact same situation I'm going through? What would I naturally say to that friend? How would I say it? And also, what would my physical stance be toward that friend? And
Mm.
then just try it with yourself. Try
Mm.
treating yourself literally the same way you would treat a good friend you cared about. And you'll see that it makes a drastic difference in your ability to cope and to make wise decisions.
Mm. So true and so powerful. Yeah, I think it's so easy to be hard on ourselves because we tend to have such high expectations of ourselves, and yet we don't have such high expectations typically of other people. And so that makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. And it takes a mindfulness to do that, doesn't it? You need to kind of take that pause before you
Yes.
jump in or leap in and react. Take that mindful pause to think about how you could speak to yourself differently. And then in that way, you're responding rather than reacting, aren't you?
Exactly, that's right. And by the way, it doesn't mean you don't have very high standards for yourself, because if you care about yourself, you're going to have high standards for yourself, right?
Mm.
The whole difference is when you fall short of your standards, does that mean you're inadequate? Does that mean you hate yourself? Does that mean you shame yourself?
Mm.
If you do, it's going to actually make it harder for you to make productive changes.
Mm.
But if you come from a place of care, first of all, it's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to make mistakes. What can I learn from this mistake? And then the motivation to reach your standards comes from care, not from fear of being inadequate. And it's actually, we know from a lot of research, it's a much more effective way to reach your goals.
Mm. It's so powerful. And, I think about how I speak to my children as well. So even if we're not thinking about how we might speak to another dear friend, for those of us with children, it's just another way of approaching it, isn't it? Is how do we speak to them? It's softly. And I think even just now, one of my daughters often says to me, you know, when she hears myself say, oh, you know, I got that wrong, or I did that wrong, or whatever, is mistakes are proof you're trying, mummy. It's okay to fail, but it's not okay not to try. And I love that, you know, it's so simple and yet so powerful. And it just brings us all to that same level, doesn't it? Which I think compassion and self-compassion does. It's a way of connecting to each other. So thank you so much for the wisdom that you have shared here today. It's been really fantastic. I mean, I do study this, I use your book, I use your work, but even sitting here today, I've learned some new things. So I really thank you for that.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you.